right. Well, how do folks feel about getting started? We have about 36 folks in the Zoom, and it seems like it's tapered off. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. And if folks join a little bit later, that's fine too. So my name is Liz Hague. I am a senior portfolio manager at Equal Justice Works. And I am so excited to welcome you here today for our session on cultivating social change through community lawyering. We are so grateful that you all were able to join us today on a Saturday to hear from these amazing speakers. So just as a quick accessibility note, if you would like to enable closed captioning on your screen, please click the closed captioning option at the bottom of the screen. And if you have any questions or comments for our panelists, and I really hope that you do have questions, please do type those questions into the Pathable chat box. We've disabled the Zoom question function or the Zoom chat function. And we definitely have time at the end for you all to ask questions. So again, encourage you to put anything you might want to ask our speakers into the chat box on Pathable. This session will run for about an hour. If you have time, if you need to leave for an interview or some other reason, you can always rejoin the session. And the session will be recorded. So if you're unable to rejoin, you will get to listen at a later date. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Cordova to kick us off.
Hello, everybody. My name is Joseph Cordova. I'm an attorney with Florida Legal Services. I was a 2018 Equal Justice Works Fellow. I'm very excited to be here today. I'm a very excited and proud Equal Justice Works alum. And here's what I'm thinking. Anaya, do you want to introduce yourself real quick? And then you're welcome to throw it back to me and I can do about 10 minutes of my work. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, that sounds good. So good morning, everyone. Well, at least it's morning where I am in Louisiana. My name's Anaya and my pronouns are she, they, and I'm an advocacy strategist with the ACLU of Louisiana. And before all of that, I was actually the student chair of Equal Justice Works National Advisory Committee. And I actually still have the coffee mug from the last time I was on the advisory committee. It still has the old EJW logo on it. So that probably gives away how old I am, but I'm really happy to be here. So I'll toss it back to Joe.
All right, terrific, thank you. So we are going to be spending some time today talking to you all about the concept of community lawyering. And we're excited for this conversation, and we really want the conversation to be a lot of back and forth with some Q&A. So as we kind of do about 10 minutes of our own work and discussion of what we've done in the past, we really hope that you guys are able to develop some questions of your own and some talking points that you'd like us to kind of go back to or speak to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work I've done over the past few years. So in 2018, I was an Equal Justice Works Fellow. I did a Design Your Own Fellowship. My Design Your Own Fellowship was a project specific to North Central Florida, where I worked with farm workers and immigrant communities. And my fellowship, well, I definitely practiced immigration law because anytime you put yourself in an immigrant community, those are going to be the majority of questions that come your way. The goal of my project was to bring community and legal resources into this farm worker community and immigrant community. So as I approached this community, it wasn't so much, hi, I'm an attorney, let me see what I can do for you guys. It was more, hi, I'm an attorney, let's see how we can empower this community to become stronger and more aware of their resources and not necessarily become masters of pro se, legal representation, but masters of reaching out and utilizing the legal resources that might be available to them and having a better understanding of what those resources are. So when I approach my work and I use the community lawyering approach, the idea is that you're going into a community to lift them up, not to do their work for them. You're going to do a lot of work, and a lot of times that work is going to come in the form of representation. But the idea is that at the end of your time with that community, they are stronger and more able to self-advocate. So there are 4 tenets of community lawyering that I like to speak to, and I'll share a couple stories with it, and then I'll pass it back to Anaya. The first one that I like to talk about is building trust. This is more than just walking in and having that attorney-client trust relationship. While that is definitely a major part of it, What we're talking about when we talk about building trust with the community lawyering approach, we're talking about the community believing in you and believing that you believe in them. And really having that relationship that's built on, you might be a stranger to us, we've never met you before, but you've spent time laying a foundation of trust and relationships that we're going to trust you with our stories. We're going to trust you with our challenges. We're going to trust you with our secrets. We're going to trust you with helping us get across and over these barriers, okay? So when you adopt a community lawyering approach, sometimes that trust building is informal trust building. It comes in the form of just being a member of the community. So my story is one of my very first nights in my fellowship, I took my son to the high school football game in the community. We just bought a ticket and sat in the stands. And at halftime, I started having conversations with the other parents that were sitting around me, just explaining who I was, introducing myself. It just so happens that one of the parents that I struck up a conversation with, to this day, she is my closest colleague. And we work together. Basically, every week we get a chance to see each other. She is the director or the coordinator for the Farm Worker Career Development Program. It just so happens that we were sitting next to each other at the football game that night. But that's just a little example of, you're just kind of there to be in the community building that trust. One other little story I'd like to share is that I found a community resource that said, Joe, you can come on in and you can have open community office hours once a week, and we'll just have community members come by and you can do some free consultations just to kind of develop and get an idea of what this community is facing. Well, nobody was showing up. So I had to start doing more of that informal trust building, showing up to just community events. If you're comfortable and you're invited, you can always show up to like church services or something like that. And so that's actually one of the things that I did. So I went to the Spanish language mass, and the first time I went, I grew up Catholic, so it was very comfortable for me. I knew what was going on. My Spanish is semi-fluent, so I was able to follow along. First time I went, all eyes were on me, the stranger in town. Who is this guy sitting in the pews worshiping next to us? But as I started to develop more of those relationships and show up around town and shop at the small businesses and have myself, eating lunch at the small restaurants, people got to know me. They got to see me with other people they trusted. By the second time I went to the Spanish language mass, before the priest could even leave at the end of the mass, I had a line of people waiting to see me. There was literally, I didn't even get a chance to leave the pew I was sitting in because there was a line of folks waiting to ask me their questions. It's just an example of, you never know when you're going to start, or what I'm getting at is, you might have in your mind that you're going to have an office and a desk, and that's where people are going to show up and ask you legal questions. When you're doing community lawyering, be prepared to be a lawyer anytime you're in the community. That's how you're kind of building that trust. So those little stories go a long way. Does that mean I practice law in a church? No. What it means, though, is that people started to see me as someone that they could come to. The second thing I like to talk about when we talk about a community lawyering approach is that once you've built that trust, you have to develop a sense of awareness for the community. A lot of times, and my supervisor told me this one time, she said, Joe, sometimes the community doesn't know the barriers and challenges they face. And you have to bring that awareness to them. So as much as you're bringing Know Your Rights presentations and you're doing presentations in front of the community to tell them these are your rights and your protections under the law, sometimes you're also the one bringing to them the awareness of how these protections and rights are being violated. The more you can reach people and present to them, these are the challenges that your community faced, and these are the rights and protections you have, you're increasing the knowledge and awareness of the people in the community to basically say, hey, wait a sec, I didn't know we had those rights. And I didn't know those rights were being violated. Let's do something about it. The third thing I like to talk about is it's not enough to just bring in an awareness of rights and protections and challenges, but you also have to enhance and empower the skills of the community. So for me, for example, one of the hardest barriers of our community anytime you're working in an immigrant community, sometimes is English language skills. So myself and some other community leaders, we would host, I would host Know Your Rights legal presentations, but I would do it as a Learn English as a Second Language evening class. So I would prepare a lesson plan with a lot of English vocabulary. I would prepare to teach the Know Your Rights presentation as if I'm also teaching English. So at the same time, I'm bringing awareness into the community, I'm also helping them increase their English language skills. That's just one example. Another thing I did was I grabbed a group of graduating high school seniors, and before they headed off to college, I did a leadership program with them during the summer. We talked about public speaking, we talked about getting to know their community, and basically instilled inside of them a sense of, you guys are about to go off to college, and when you graduate, it'd be great if you could come back into your community and be community leaders. And so I spent about 6-7 weeks with this group of graduating high school seniors, basically helping them understand what it means to be a community leader and instilling in them a sense of those leadership skills. And then the last thing I like to talk about is, you, as a community lawyer, you always have to know your role, because the goal of the community lawyer is to help the community reach community-driven goals and community-driven strategies. So the role you play is that you cannot be the person in front that drags the community behind you, because it's not your goals that we're after, it's the community's goals. So you have to really identify where you sit in that community. Are you behind them, supporting them, giving them a little push from the back? Are you in front of them, just helping them guide the way towards reaching these goals? Or are you working alongside the side of the community or inside the community? The answer is probably all of the above, but you have to know where you fit, because the last thing you want to do is come to the end of your time in the community and say, I did it, I reached all my goals, but the community didn't reach any of their goals. So you have to make sure that your goals and the community goals are one and the same. And if one has to be above the other, it has to be the community's goals, because what we're ultimately getting at is sustainability of the community. If you leave the community and they're not better off for your presence and your time with them, you really haven't done anything with them. Okay, so it's all about the community being stronger after your time. So I'm going to pass it back to Anaya and let her fill in some of the voids of what I might have said and share her stories. I'm excited to hear from her as well. So take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I guess I can start with how I got into community lawyering. It's kind of an interesting story. So I actually was an organizer before I went to law school. And the group I was working with as an organizer, we were all young Black people from Louisiana, and we were planning a protest. And so we reached out to a local attorney just to understand if there were any relevant laws we needed to know about. And, you know, we literally just needed to know if there were any laws that would impact our plans. And instead, the lawyer used that opportunity to kind of talk down to us and to try and get us to change our minds about what we had worked for months to plan. And so that experience of interacting with this patronizing lawyer who was white, it actually motivated me to go to law school, because I was just sitting there thinking, you know, my community deserves so much better than what we just got. And so that was really kind of the driving force behind me wanting to go to law school. So I guess now it makes a little bit of sense to, you know, talk about how community lawyering might differ from the lawyering that you might be taught in law school. So to me, community lawyering starts with the question of, what does the community need? And has the community even asked me to contribute? So in my experience, the people who are closest to the pain, who have been pushed to the margins, and for me, a lot of the work that I do centers around racial and gender justice. So for me, that's Black communities and communities of color and LGBTQ plus people. Most likely, they already know that there's a problem in their community. And chances are, those folks, because of their pain, they at least have an understanding of what they need. And so it's important for you as the community lawyer to really center and respect their leadership. Remember that story I shared a little earlier about the not so great lawyer? So because that lawyer didn't really center our leadership and talked down to us instead of supporting us and and really doing what we asked, that led down to a break in trust. And in my opinion, it further harmed our community that was already facing so much oppression. And so that piece that Joe mentioned earlier about trust building, I can't emphasize enough just how important it is to build that, and really how easy it is to break it down, to have it be broken down. So I do have a story about some communities that I've worked with recently, that I've been really honored to work with recently. And hopefully it kind of highlights the challenges as well as the benefits and the rewards of doing this type of lawyering. So I think I mentioned this at the beginning, but I am born and raised in Louisiana, and we're in the Deep South. We are very economically poor. And the median income in Louisiana is about $27,000, which is not a lot of money at all. And so something that's also really interesting about the Deep South is that we have the highest population of LGBTQ plus people in the country, which I think is amazing. But historically, that same community has been over-criminalized and faces deep, deep poverty. And for me, those two issues are not siloed. And so in a state like Louisiana, where there's no statewide employment protections for LGBTQ plus people, a lot of people are really left to participate in the underground economy and to do things that are criminalized, like sex work, just to earn an income. And so, of course, you run the risk of arrest while trying to make a living. And we know that those risks are compounded for LGBTQ plus people of color and those that are undocumented. And so if you're not employed, you have a higher chance of being incarcerated. And so you can see how unemployment among LGBTQ plus people in Louisiana leads to incarceration. And this contributes to other forms of stigma and phobias. And we saw that phobia in a major way in the anti-trans sports bills and gender affirming bills that were introduced in our state legislature this year. So thankfully, we defeated all 4 of those bills, which would have prohibited trans girls from playing on girls' sports teams, and would have also prohibited trans kids from getting the health care that would have affirmed their identity. So we defeated all 4 of those bills, which is really no small feat for a deeply conservative state like Louisiana. And thankfully, we did this work, and this is really important, alongside trans and gender nonconforming people who unfortunately had no knowledge or exposure working in the legal system or at the Capitol doing policy work. And so a lot of my job while we were working to defeat those bills was explaining how those systems work. And the great thing about doing that type of explaining work is that you as law students can do that now. You don't need a law license to help people understand how a bill becomes a law. You don't need a law license to explain what happens from the time a person is arrested until the time that they're sentenced and convicted. And so that's really important to remember. You can start doing that accessibility work now. Now, to go back to the story, again, because Louisiana is so poor, that means that a lot of people in my state cannot afford lawyers. And so they have to face this system on their own. And so I did mention that we defeated all 4 of the anti-trans bills, but lawmakers tried to bring up those bills again just a couple of months after we had defeated them. And so a brave group of trans and GNC folks went to the Capitol to peacefully protest, and they were violently thrown out. And to be honest, they knew that this was probably going to happen, that they were probably going to be thrown out and that they were probably going to be arrested. And so they actually called me weeks before to help them think through representation and jail support in the event that they were arrested. And one of the things about our legal system, like I said, is that it's very difficult to understand and really frightening to go through if you don't have formal training or experience. And so one of the things that I'm passionate about is making sure that people understand how our system works. They understand what laws mean and what their rights are. And so in addition to my traditional lawyering work of, volunteering to represent those trans and GNC protesters, I also help translate the laws and ordinance, and I really put them in plain speak for the community. And that knowledge can be really empowering. And so that's one thing you can do now is make this system more accessible for folks, especially for folks who feel like they are often pushed to the sides or they're neglected. So I can toss it back to Joe. And
I'm going to ask you a question. Yeah, listen to your story. Can you speak a little bit about the importance of partnering with non-legal advocate organizations?
Yes. I mean, to be honest, that is really the only way that I work personally. Like, I really tend to enjoy working more with people that don't have a legal background. They're not attorneys or legal professionals, because to me, that helps me stay grounded. One of the things about going to law school and having this, amazing training that not a lot of people often are able to get is that it really kind of conditions you to think a certain way, which, I mean, we can go back and forth on the pros and cons of that. But at the end of the day, it's really helpful to have someone who's in the community, rooted in the community, who can kind of help you stay abreast of what is going on. And they can kind of help, check your thinking a little bit, because I mean, and I'm probably maybe speaking for some of y'all, but I know for me, law school was incredibly isolating in that I spent, more time in the classroom and in the library, more time there than I wish I would have had more time to be in the community. And so having that isolation and really kind of being conditioned to really think like a lawyer, it was kind of hard for me to stay as rooted to community as I wanted to. And so one of the ways that I helped kind of, circumvent that was by staying connected to people who were in the community day in and day out. And so I like to joke with one of the people that I work with most frequently that we're partners in crime, which I guess as a lawyer, you probably shouldn't say that you're partnering in crime with someone. I don't really know. But that's a very long answer, but I do hope it was helpful.
Well, yeah, and I'll piggyback on your answer a little bit. One of the things I really picked up on what you just said was how it helps keep you grounded. That's when we say that as attorneys in the field, it reminds us that when you're doing community lawyering, you want to be your authentic self. Authenticity is so important because communities can see through if you're pretending to be someone you're not, if you're trying to impress people who don't need to be impressed, if you're not trying to impress people who need to be, they can kind of see through who you are and who you're pretending to be. Like I'll throw myself out there. I mentioned my project and most of the work I do is in migrant farm worker communities. My last name's Cordova. My family is Mexican. My grandparents are fluent Spanish speakers. I'm 6'4". I'm pale skinned. I don't speak with an accent, and my Spanish is very academic. So when I go into a community, I see my family. When they see me, they do not see their family. So in my mind and my perception of the work I'm about to do, I feel extremely comfortable right away. But that doesn't mean they're going to perceive me the same way I'm perceiving them. So one of my biggest friends and colleagues in the community, she is a Mexican immigrant and she's been there for 20 years. And she pulled me aside one day and she said, try to be seen with me as much as possible. If you go to lunch, invite me. If you go to this thing, invite me. If I do this, I'm going to invite you. because these people trust me. The more they see you with me, the more they're going to trust you. So the non-legal advocate organizations, community leaders, partners, they're your lifeblood. If you're going to be doing community lawyering appropriately, it's not enough to just show up with your law degree and say, I'm here. You have to find those partners in those networks. Yeah. I'm seeing something in the chat box.
Yeah,
should we go to questions?
Yeah, well, so I was kind of chuckling to myself because the question in the chat box came in about 2 minutes ago and you were already starting to address this question. So the timing seems perfect. So I will read off the question and then perhaps you two can add any reflections you have on top of what you already shared, Joseph. So I'm wondering if both of our speakers would talk specifically about the experience or observations of community-based lawyering while appearing white or cisgendered, and particularly working with communities that you are not a part of as a white person, cisgendered, non-native, non-immigrant, etc. So again, really great timing because I feel like you were already sharing a lot of those reflections, but wanted to put it to you a bit more directly and see if either of you had additional thoughts to share.
I kind of spoke to a little bit, but Anaya, do you want to jump in? Do you have something to add to that?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that. So I guess, I would say first be open to the idea of learning. One of the things that I've done in the past is I have coordinated anti-oppression trainings for people that come from privileged communities. And I remember one training after I had just finished it, this white person came up to me and just asked me, am I a terrible person? And I'm like, I don't really know you that well, but no, you're probably not, but you're learning something new and that's uncomfortable. But lean into doing that work of building trust with communities and welcome that, because it really, like Joe said, it paves the way for authentic relationships. And realize that it's going to take time to build relationships with folks, especially if you don't come from the community you're trying to work in. People are definitely going to be suspicious of you when you first show up. At least that's been my experience down here. And that means that you have to demonstrate trust. And there's really no shortcuts with that. You just have to keep showing up and you have to be consistent. And the last thing I'll add is that, you definitely don't want to come in as a savior. As I said before, communities probably already have a good idea of what they need, or they have a good idea of, what they're facing and what they're up against. And your job as someone who practices community lawyering is to support them in that. So if people are looking to you because they think you have all the answers and you're going to help fix this whole thing, then you're probably taking up way too much space and you're not working in a very collaborative way.
Yeah, I love that you said, if you come in with the mentality of you're going to be the savior, you're going to unfortunately adopt boundaries that don't fit what you're actually there to do. Because, and when I say boundaries, I mean, there is a point where you are the attorney. That's the truth. It's very authentic. You are the attorney. And there are going to be, as much as you're doing community work, every time you finish a Know Your Rights presentation or you do some community work, there's going to be 3 or 4 people that stick around afterwards and say, I got my own issue. Can you help me out with that? And you have to be able to answer to yourself. Is my answer to this question yes? If my answer is no, what are the reasons for my no? And that's where you start to recognize, what role am I playing in this community and what work am I doing? I know for me, when I went to law school, it was with the intention of doing this type of work. I imagined myself going into a community and saying, look, guys, I got this law degree. Let's all get behind it and let's do something with it. It's as much yours as it is mine. But it does kind of play into the effect that, well, it actually is more mine than yours because it's my name that's on things and it's my signature that's on forms. So you have to recognize the role you're playing, what boundaries you plan to adopt. And if you come in with that savior mentality, you might be kind of overstepping some of your own boundaries that you haven't drawn yet. So be aware that you have an opportunity to be a part of a community, not to save the community. I love that you said that, Anaya. I'm ready for questions if you are, Anaya. All right.
Great. So we do have another question, two other questions actually. Great. Please keep the questions coming. These are great. Okay, so here is another question. This is a question for Anaya. How would you recommend starting accessibility work during law school, particularly for 1Ls?
Yeah, that is a wonderful, wonderful question. So, yeah, I guess I could go back a little bit and talk about how I built community lawyering into my career during law school. So, yeah, I was president of my NLG chapter, and we held safe spaces, forums, and discussions on race and all sorts of things that probably annoyed my administration. And here at EJW, I was on the National Advisory Committee for 2 years. And the first time I went to an EJW conference, it was me and some other Black law students. And we were just talking about how expensive it was for us to get to the conference back when you could still see people in person. And so when we were planning the next year's conference on the committee, I brought up that conversation. And from there, that's how the diversity scholarships were born. And so that's a little bit about me. But I think the reason that I wanted to share those two things is that it really kind of shows the importance of finding your community and finding your people. Ella Baker, who's one of my sheroes, she was an organizer from the Deep South and then later moved to New York. She always would ask organizers that she was working with, who are your people? And in law school, you have to find your people, especially if you're one of those folks who are coming in because you want to try and use this imperfect system for good. Because I mean, to be quite frank, they don't call it justice school, they call it law school. And so, you know, again, I might be projecting here, but I definitely felt a little isolated because the way that I wanted to use my degree and use my skills, it was very different from what was being taught to me in classrooms. And so for you, you know, you could find your people in a lot of different ways. You could join a progressive student organization, or you could join community groups actually that are in your city. So going beyond the four walls of your law school, or once you get further along in your legal career, you could do clinic. I actually worked on fair housing issues when I was in clinic, like Joe did, but probably not as well as Joe does. And so you could do different things like that. But the point is to really find your people and to also speak truth to power. And you have to have the courage to do that, even if you are alone.
Thank you so much. We do have another question. I'm going to go ahead and read it out. So have either of you found it difficult to maintain a work-life balance when your job depends so much on interpersonal relationships? Do you think there are unique mental health challenges to working intimately with the communities that you serve?
I'll jump in. So to the first question, I'll give you a couple more examples of some things I did that were borderline too much as far as diving into the community and building trust, but it ended up working out perfect. So I have 4 kids. I enrolled my kids in the school district of the community. So I became another parent. So when it came time for parent drop-off, parent pickup, I was there alongside the community. The other thing is I volunteered to coach the middle school basketball team. So eventually I became someone in the community that wore a hat that wasn't just attorney. I was parent, I was coach. Eventually, I was community member. That all went very well, but it definitely did start to blend, because if I have basketball practice followed by a community know your rights event or something like that, pretty soon I don't know what hat I'm wearing, because the day becomes, a 12, 16-hour day, which is common for an attorney. But when you're doing community lawyering, sometimes that 16-hour day includes 6 hours that isn't really attorney work, it's community work. But it didn't, that part actually did not weigh on me too much. I think I was able to strike a pretty good work-life balance because I enjoyed the community. So it wasn't pulling from me. But to the second question, as you get more and more involved in clients' lives and challenges and barriers, compassion fatigue is a real thing. It really does weigh on you. It does get to the point where when Friday afternoon comes around, you are exhausted. You are emotionally and mentally exhausted. And when Monday comes around, if you did not give yourself a break, you're already worn out and it's Monday morning. So for me, Saturday morning, I go for a long run. And that's when I release everything mentally and emotionally. And when I'm back from the run, it's college football, and that's that. I don't open email, I don't check text and stuff like that because I have to be fresh for Monday morning. But it is a real thing. So if you don't have your version of that, you need to develop one.
Yeah, and if I could just hop in here too, I consider self-care and wellness to be a requirement. In fact, I sometimes call it self-labor because it's just as hard as my actual job. But, and maybe this could be a little controversial, but I don't really believe in the idea of work-life balance. Instead, I try to be patient with myself in accepting that there's some days where my community work is going to be my top priority. And then there's other days where my community work is going to take a back seat so that I can focus on my family, my farm, and other things that are important to me. And, I've just realized that that's really important because not only do I deserve the best version of myself, but, so does my community. And so I guess you're probably wondering, what does all of that look like in practice? And I realized that I could be speaking from a place of privilege because I don't have childcare responsibilities. But every morning, I write down a list of 5 things that I'm grateful for. And if I get texts after hours, I typically don't respond until the next business day. I also text people before I call them to ask if they have time to talk because I want to respect other people's boundaries as well. I use an app called Stay Focused that blocks me from checking news sites and doing doom scrolling during certain, blocks of time in the evening. And, I think also in addition to what Joe mentioned about compassion fatigue, I often sometimes get this feeling of I could be doing more. And so to combat that, at the end of each workday, I make a list of everything I've done that day to remind myself that hey, Anaya, you actually did do a lot of great work today. And, sometimes it's not even work related things. Sometimes it's just I did my laundry today. And so, give yourself reasons to be proud of yourself. And, I'd like to just end that by sharing that it took me years to build up that set of practices. And, sometimes I do fall short. And while I'm generally consistent at enforcing boundaries, I still feel this pinch of shame or guilt when I do so. And so I guess I say all that to say that this is still something that I'm working on too.
Thank you both for that. We do not have any additional questions in the chat box right now. So again, encourage folks to put some questions in for the group. I'll read those out. Just gonna check the box. All right, I do not see any additional questions right now. I was thinking a lot about your reflections on how to find your community in law school and beyond. And, for the folks on this call, most of whom are law students, I wonder if you have any immediate next steps that folks could leave with, or things that you would encourage folks to do if they want to take on more of this work or learn more about it. One suggestion was the National Lawyers Guild, but curious if there's other, things that folks could plug into or start engaging with, as soon as they get off the call and with all the excitement of what they've learned from you too.
I know when I began the process of applying for my Equal Justice Works Fellowship, I think the application was released, I want to say May, maybe early June of 2017. So it would have been my 2L year. Before the application was released, I actually spent my spring break researching the community I wanted to work in. I think that's extremely important when you do community lawyering work and you want to identify a community. That community might be geographic, it might be based on demographics, it might be based on a shared challenge. There's two things to consider. Well, there's more than two, but the two big things you want to consider when you identify a community. One, do your research, do your statistical research, look at your demographics, look at your population, look at everything that the numbers and the research can show. But that's not enough. Two, you have to spend time in the community. And I know that during COVID, it's going to be a little bit difficult doing that, but you have to jump into that community and get to know what it feels like to be there, to breathe the air there, what things smell like, where do people get their groceries, where do people go when they're out of gas, and that kind of thing. So before I even applied for my Equal Justice Work Fellow, I had already interviewed school principals, community leaders, farm workers, and everything like that, because I had to know what it meant to be a part of this community as opposed to what the numbers said about the community, because they're two very different things.
Yeah. I mean, Joe really kind of like summed it up pretty greatly. So I guess, I guess I just have like a couple of different pieces of advice or like things to remember. So, the first thing that I say to law students and people who are just kind of like coming into this work for the first time is think about what the system means and what it is. For some of you, the legal system might represent justice, a way to make things right. But for some of us, we see it as another tool of the powerful, a system that's oppressed and hurt people. And so as an attorney, you can either reinforce that oppression or you can use this imperfect system to help build power for marginalized communities. And the second thing I'd add is you also want to be careful of how you measure wins. So plain and simple, this type of lawyering is not going to always result in court victories. It just won't. I mean, some days you'll have days where you're able to keep a single mother in her home and you're able to provide good eviction defense. And then some days a federal court will essentially just trash all over your brief. So, what are some other ways you can measure success? And for me, there's another group of people I work with, and it consists of family members who have had loved ones murdered by the New Orleans Police Department. And so I work with them pretty closely, and I consider it a win when they invite me to their birthday parties and things like that, and the ways that they invite me to collaborate with them on suits and negotiations and settlements and things like that. So, be mindful of how you measure your wins. And the last thing I'd say too is, and again, this might be stirring the pot just a little bit, but everything that you learn in law school was probably devoid of context and history. So your law professors probably have told you that the law is objective, but in my opinion, the law has very real material consequences for people of color, and especially if you belong to multiple marginalized communities. So for example, if you're a trans woman of color or a person of color with a disability, and it has been that way for a very long time, and it was intentionally set up that way, in my opinion. So learn that and don't expect people from the community to teach that to you. And recognize that even after you get your degree, you're going to be studying for a very, very long time.
Excellent, thank you. Incredibly helpful advice. Thank you both. So we do have one more question. The question is, what sorts of classes and clinics would you take while in law school to prepare for this type of work? I know we've touched on this a little bit, but again, any more specific recommendations or additional recommendations would be great.
For me, I'm going to throw, well, okay, first of all, because I did immigration community work, immigration law was extremely important for me to take. But I'm going to highlight two courses that I think really helped me understand what was going to happen for me after graduation. One is social justice lawyering. I don't know if your college offers a course like this. Maybe it's referred to as poverty law or something like that. But social justice lawyering, that's where I learned about community lawyering. That's where I learned all those other cases that don't make it to the constitutional law case books, but they really have the impact on local communities. A lot of times in social justice lawyering courses, you're also learning about what it means to be a social justice lawyer, as opposed to just the casework. That for me was the best class I took in law school. And without that class, I definitely wouldn't have been able to kind of stand on the shoulders of my professor to kind of do the work I'm doing. The second one I'm going to highlight, and I'll kind of qualify why I'm saying this, is criminal procedure. Not because you're planning on being a criminal attorney, and not because your community members are all criminals, but if you're working with vulnerable populations, the world and the system sees them as criminals. And so you have to be ready to understand what criminal procedure means to them. Know your rights presentations. I do immigration community work. A lot of the questions I get are immigration law, but I insist on teaching them, here's what you do when you get pulled over by the police. These are your rights. These are your Fourth Amendment rights. These are your Fifth Amendment rights. These are your rights under the law. These are your Sixth Amendment rights. I don't know if I will not, or I know for a fact, I will not be your criminal attorney, but I hope you won't need a criminal attorney because you follow these rules. The more you can be aware of that, you're going to be able to create a necessary awareness in a community so that they do not fall into the traps of being labeled as a criminal at a young age or at an age or an activity that they have no business being labeled as a criminal. But it's going to happen if you're working with vulnerable populations.
Yeah, ConCrim Pro, even if it's taught by the most driest professor that you can think of, it really is valuable because it's basically a civil rights course if you think about it. And so, I can just kind of, tack on to what Joe said, even if your courses are boring, like try and make them have some real world connection. Like, for example, everyone has to take torts, which is basically personal injury law. And so here in Louisiana, environmental racism is very much a thing. We have a lot of oil and gas companies that are just doing a lot of harm to communities of color and also to our wetlands, which are unfortunately the only thing that's really protecting our coast from hurricanes. And so one of the things that I kind of thought about when I was taking torts, like, I don't really care about the egg metaphor that they teach you about in that like random case that I can't remember the name of right now. But instead, I was thinking about, wow, like how could this course be useful for the Black people that live in Cancer Alley, right near New Orleans, whose land is surrounded by these oil and gas companies and whose, their respiratory systems are being affected because they're breathing in all this toxic air from these emissions. And you could also do the same for contracts too. You could think about how a lot of people of color, because they don't often have the money to pay out of pocket to get their loved ones, bail paid, what does it look like when they sign these very unfair contracts with bail bonds people, so tie even the most boring course that you could think of, try and tie it to the real world issues that you want to work to dismantle. And I can't say it enough. Law school is not supposed to be your four walls, in my opinion, especially if you're one of the folks that are going to be designing your own fellowship. You need to start making introductions to organizations now if they don't know you already. And I know that, it's kind of difficult to balance that type of work with, traditional studying and your course load. But this is something that you want to do. And like Joe and I have said, there's no shortcuts with doing this type of work. So you just kind of have to think about how you're going to build in that time to build those relationships and maintain them.
Great. Well, folks, we're going to go ahead and wrap up here in a few minutes. But I think the last thing I wanted to put to you both is there have been there's been such great advice shared from both of you. But I think the one last question I wanted to put to you is if you have one piece of advice for someone who wants to incorporate community lawyering into the work that they are already doing. And I think that'll close us out for the session.
I'll jump in. I feel extremely lucky, very fortunate that I got to be an Equal Justice Works Fellow because I did a design your own fellowship, which means I created it and then I got to do it. The reason why I'm very extremely fortunate, lucky, because there's not a lot of jobs out there that say, what would you like to do? And we'll hire you to do it. But whatever job you do get, bring with you your own ideas, bring with you a style of work that you plan to do. Because community lawyering, it's been around for a while, but it hasn't really taken the world by storm yet, okay? So folks like myself and Anaya and the handful of other community lawyers out there, we're trying to keep this thing alive. We're trying to grow it. And the more we present it, not necessarily just to law school students and new attorneys, but the more we present it to law firms, organizations that have been around for a while, the more they like it and the more they want to adopt it. So don't shy away from community lawyering because that's not what you were hired to do. Bring it with you and say, hey, in addition to what you hired me to do, here's the approach I'd like to take. I really believe that your supervisor, your leadership team will look at it and say, this sounds fantastic, and I'm glad you brought this to our attention. So I think that would be my advice.
Yeah, for sure. And again, just to piggyback on what Joe said, sometimes it can be really overwhelming to think about the scope and the scale of all of the different ways that so many different communities are disenfranchised and neglected. But the opposite side of that is that it means that there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration, and there's a lot of opportunities for you to jump in with your law degree. Now, when I say that there's a lot of ways to collaborate, what I'm really trying to get at is that it's going to take a lot of different skill sets to really start to tackle these issues. It can't just be you using your law degree. Even if you're a fantastic community lawyering, it's probably going to incorporate organizing. It's going to have to incorporate some healing work. It's going to have to incorporate pretty much every single different skill set you can think of from people that you probably didn't imagine that you would ever work with. One of the most rewarding things that I've done recently is working with therapy practitioners, working alongside families who've been affected by police brutality and, not only helping their complaints progress through the system so that they could get redress, but also making sure that they have the mental health services that they need to try and handle their trauma. And so those type of unique partnerships are going to be invaluable. And to me, that's one of the greatest things about community lawyering. It's recognizing that everyone has a gift to bring to the table. So I think that's what I would leave you with.
Well, thank you both so much. That was an incredible session. And I would ask everyone to please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists today. The recording of this session will be available for all of you to listen starting tomorrow. And you will also have access to this Pathable site for 1 year, which will allow you to come back and watch any of the conference sessions you were not able to watch live. So if you want to revisit the conversation and these great tips at the start of next semester or before you start your summer job that I'm sure you got during CCF, this would be a great resource for you to use. We also want to thank our conference sponsor, Idealist, for helping make this year's conference and career fair possible. If you haven't already, we encourage you to listen to our Community of Impact, a conversation with Amidar and David Stern, where Amidar, founder and executive director of Idealist, shares with us his insights on both starting and maintaining a public interest career. Lastly, if you have any questions about this year's fair or how equal justice works can help you launch your public interest career, particularly if you want to know more about summer opportunities or our fellowship programs after these great presenters, come speak to one of our representatives from 12 to 6 today at 12 to 6 p.m. Eastern time today. You can find us by searching for Equal Justice Works under the Organizations tab. So again, if you have any questions about our fellowships programs, how to take part, the leadership opportunities for law students or the programming we offer in the summer, our representatives can answer any of those questions. And with that, I think we're going to conclude the session. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. And thank you again to our fantastic speakers. I personally learned so much from you and know that everyone else on the call did as well. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Anaya. I loved sharing the screen with you. So thank you.